A wealthy widow paid her therapist $847,000 over 4 years. Not in a lump sum, not in one moment of desperation, but gradually, steadily, in increments that felt like gifts at the time and felt like theft only after the woman disappeared. The widow didn't report a crime. She reported an abandonment, because when you realize someone you loved might have been constructed, the missing money becomes secondary to the missing person. This isn't a story about fraud, though fraud occurred. This is a story about what happens when the person designed to heal you becomes the person who breaks you, and you can't decide if that breaking was intentional or if it was the price of being finally completely seen. In 1948, New York City, the wealthy believed therapy was a private sanctuary. They had no idea it was being weaponized by someone who understood human vulnerability more intimately than she understood herself. This is the story of how a single lie told consistently enough became the only truth that mattered, and how sometimes the person we love most is the person we know least. Margaret was 47 years old when her husband died. Not suddenly. For 3 years she watched him diminish. The war had taken something from him that came home in his body, but not in his mind, and the body eventually followed the mind into absence. When he finally died, Margaret had already grieved him. What she hadn't grieved was the role she'd played as his wife, the identity she'd built around keeping him stable, keeping him present, keeping him convinced that life was worth continuing. When he was gone, Margaret discovered she didn't know how to exist for herself. She had money, his family's money, old money, the kind that compounds silently in bank accounts while the people who own it decay quietly in Park Avenue apartments. She had an apartment. She had a circle of women who'd known her since childhood, women whose husbands had also returned broken or not at all, but she didn't have a reason to get out of bed beyond obligation. This is the precise vulnerability that certain people can smell. Not weakness, but a specific kind of emptiness, the kind that comes from having structured your entire life around someone else's survival. Margaret's friends recommended therapy. It was 1948. Psychology was becoming fashionable among the wealthy, a way to process trauma that didn't require confession to a priest or admission to a hospital. Margaret found Dr. Catherine Wells through a recommendation from another widow. Catherine had a small practice in a building on the Upper East Side, an office decorated in soft grays and pale blues, designed to make you feel held by the space itself. Catherine was approximately Margaret's age, though there was something ageless about her, the kind of agelessness that comes from being genuinely interested in other people's stories instead of accumulating your own. In their first session, Catherine asked Margaret what had brought her in. Margaret began to explain about her husband's death, about the years of caring for someone who couldn't care for themselves, about the peculiar grief of losing someone you'd already lost years ago. And Catherine listened in a way Margaret had never been listened to before, not with the polite attention of social obligation, not with the distracted sympathy of someone who was already thinking about their next appointment. Catherine listened as though Margaret's words were the most important information she'd ever received. She asked follow-up questions that showed she'd been genuinely tracking the emotional architecture of Margaret's life. She remembered details from one week to the next. She noticed patterns that Margaret herself hadn't articulated. By the end of the first session, Margaret felt something shift, not healing, but the possibility of healing, the possibility that someone could see her completely and not recoil. What Margaret didn't know was that Catherine had been studying her since the moment she walked into the office, not with therapeutic curiosity, but with the precision of someone assessing vulnerability. Catherine knew within minutes that Margaret was a woman who had spent her entire adult life serving someone else's needs. She knew that Margaret's intelligence was intact but unused. She knew that Margaret's capacity for love was enormous and currently unattached. She knew that Margaret would pay any price to feel that quality of attention again, because she'd never felt it before, not even from her husband. What Catherine was doing wasn't therapy. It was an exquisite, methodical process of becoming indispensable. And Margaret, sitting in that soft gray office, experiencing being truly listened to for perhaps the first time in her life, had no framework to understand that the listening itself could be a weapon. Catherine's genius lay in her ability to identify what people needed most, and then position herself as the only source of that need. She understood that Margaret wasn't suffering from psychological illness. She was suffering from profound invisibility. For 23 years, Margaret had been the supporting character in her husband's narrative. Her own thoughts, desires, and experiences had been secondary to the project of keeping him alive. Now suddenly, That project was complete, and Margaret had no project anymore. She had no identity. Catherine recognized this immediately and gave Margaret something, a reason to exist. In therapy, Margaret mattered. Her thoughts were analyzed. Her dreams were interpreted. Her childhood was explored for meaning. Her feelings were validated. Every session, Catherine asked Margaret deeper questions, not out of therapeutic necessity, but out of what appeared to be genuine personal interest. What did you want to be before you became his wife? When was the last time you did something just for yourself? Do you think you're allowed to want things? These weren't clinical interventions. They felt like the questions of a true friend, someone who cared enough to push past surface answers. Margaret began to restructure her life around these sessions. She went twice a week, then 3 times a week. She canceled other plans to ensure availability. Her friends noticed the change in her. She seemed lighter, more present, more like herself, and they attributed it to the therapeutic process. What they didn't see was the mechanism underneath. Catherine had identified Margaret's loneliness and then become the antidote to it. She had made herself the only person who truly understood Margaret's pain. She had positioned therapy not as a temporary treatment but as a permanent relationship. During this time, Catherine was learning everything about Margaret. She learned about the inheritance, $700,000, held in trust, managed by Margaret's brother. She learned about Margaret's childhood, her relationship with her parents, the specific ways she'd learned to prioritize others' needs over her own. She learned about Margaret's dreams, which were small and domestic. She wanted to travel to Europe. She wanted to write. She wanted to feel beautiful again. She wanted someone to want her the way she'd wanted her husband, completely, consistently, without reservation. Catherine listened to these dreams and made them feel seen. More than seen, she made them feel possible. You could do that, Catherine would say. You have the means. What's stopping you? The answer was always the same. Margaret didn't know who she was outside of being needed. She was afraid of being alone with herself, and Catherine, in her infinite understanding, became the solution to that fear. What Catherine was actually doing was brilliant and terrible. She was making Margaret psychologically dependent, while positioning this dependency as healthy emotional growth. She was teaching Margaret that emotional intimacy was more valuable than financial security. She was systematically eroding Margaret's ability to trust her own judgment, and she was beginning to position herself as the only person capable of understanding what Margaret truly needed. By the end of the first 3 months, Margaret was bringing Catherine small gifts: a scarf, a bottle of wine, books Catherine had mentioned wanting to read. Catherine accepted these gifts with the kind of graciousness that made Margaret feel understood and appreciated. In therapy, gifts are usually discouraged, professional boundaries are maintained, but Catherine was not a licensed therapist. She was someone who understood that boundaries were obstacles to dependence, and dependence was the architecture of control. The transition from therapy to something else happened so gradually that Margaret didn't notice it was happening. It began with Catherine extending sessions. What was supposed to be 50 minutes became 90 minutes because Catherine said Margaret had just gotten to something important. Then sessions shifted location. Instead of the office, they would meet at Catherine's apartment, which was smaller than Margaret's in a less prestigious building, decorated carefully to appear both tasteful and somewhat struggling. Catherine would make tea. They would sit on her sofa. They would talk about Margaret's life, but increasingly, Catherine began sharing details about her own. She mentioned a difficult childhood. She referenced financial struggles that made her work in therapy necessary rather than chosen. She created, through careful self-disclosure, the appearance of genuine friendship. Margaret began to see Catherine not as a professional, but as a friend who happened to work in psychology. The word therapy stopped being used. Catherine started calling their meetings our time together. She stopped charging for sessions, or rather, she stopped calling them sessions. The money conversation began subtly. Catherine mentioned during one of their conversations that she was struggling to make rent. She said it as an aside, the way a real friend might mention a difficulty. Margaret, being someone whose entire identity was constructed around solving other people's problems, immediately offered to help, just a small loan to tide Catherine over. Catherine hesitated, which was perfect. Hesitation made the offer feel like genuine assistance rather than extraction. She said she couldn't possibly accept money from a client. Margaret said she didn't think of Catherine as a therapist anymore. She thought of her as a friend. And wasn't that what friends did? They helped each other. Catherine, after appropriate resistance, accepted. $500, which she paid back 3 weeks later, which made Margaret feel good about having helped, which made the next request easier. The second request came after Catherine had moved to a new apartment, still modest, still slightly struggling, but in a building where several wealthy people lived, which gave Margaret the impression that Catherine was becoming increasingly successful, increasingly respected. Catherine mentioned that she'd made a down payment on the apartment but was short for the deposit. Could Margaret possibly lend her $2,000? By now, the architecture of their relationship was perfectly constructed. Catherine had positioned herself as Margaret's therapist, her friend, her confidant, and her project. Margaret had become emotionally dependent, financially enmeshed, and psychologically invested in Catherine's well-being. The boundary between helping someone and enabling their dependence had been completely dissolved. What made this brilliant was that Catherine was partially living the role she'd created. She did have financial struggles. She was from a difficult background. She did value Margaret's friendship, but she was also mining that friendship for resources in a way that was systematic and deliberate. She understood that direct theft would be rejected, but financial help to a friend, financial support of someone you cared about, that was culturally sanctioned, even praised. A woman helping another woman become stable and secure, what could be more noble? Margaret's brother noticed the expenditures first. He asked her about the large withdrawals from her account. Margaret explained that she was helping a friend. He asked who. Margaret found herself reluctant to say. She realized, in that moment of hesitation, that she wasn't entirely comfortable with the explanation, that the part of her that was still rational understood something was wrong, but that rational part was very small now and very quiet. She told her brother it was her business and she stopped sharing financial information with him. This is how isolation happens, not through obvious coercion, but through the gentle rewiring of boundaries until you're no longer in contact with the people who might offer perspective. You're no longer willing to hear criticism of the person you've made yourself responsible for. You become, in essence, hostage to your own generosity. By the second year, there was no pretense of therapy. Catherine and Margaret were simply friends. Margaret had restructured her entire life around Catherine's presence. Her weekly schedule had Catherine at its center. Her emotional life had Catherine as its primary relationship. Her financial life was increasingly intertwined with Catherine's needs. And the remarkable thing was that Margaret felt better, or at least, she felt less alone. There's a specific kind of peace that comes from having your entire existence validated by another person, from being seen, understood, and made to feel like your presence matters. Catherine had become an expert at providing exactly that. She would call Margaret at specific times, creating routine and reliability. She would ask for Margaret's advice on things, making Margaret feel useful and intelligent. She would tell Margaret that she couldn't have gotten through difficult periods without her. She would position Margaret as essential. What Margaret didn't see was the mechanism. She didn't notice that Catherine had isolated her from her other friendships by consistently being more present, more understanding, more available than anyone else. She didn't notice that Catherine had positioned every other relationship as secondary, less intimate, less real. She didn't notice that Catherine had systematically eroded her connection to her brother, her cousins, anyone who might have offered an outside perspective. Margaret thought she was becoming more herself. She was actually becoming more trapped. During this period, Catherine began introducing a new element: shared plans. She talked about wanting to travel. She mentioned wanting to start a practice together. They would be a team, she said, a therapeutic partnership. She talked about needing capital to make these things happen. $50,000, she said, would change everything. They could travel to Europe together. They could build something meaningful together. They could stop living separate lives and actually build a life together. This is where the seduction reaches its peak. This is where love and predation become indistinguishable, because the offers were framed as collaboration, as partnership, as building something together. The money wasn't described as extraction. It was described as investment in their future. And Margaret, who had been gradually groomed to believe that love meant financial sacrifice, agreed. She transferred $50,000 to Catherine, and for a moment, they were partners in something. They looked at apartments together. They discussed the practice. Catherine talked about how Margaret was the only person who'd ever truly believed in her, the only person who made her feel like she could be more than she was. And Margaret, hearing this, felt the profound satisfaction of being needed in a way that mattered, of being the person who could change someone's life. What she didn't understand was that she was changing Catherine's life by enabling it, by providing the resources for Catherine to continue being what she was, someone who had learned, early, that other people's resources were the pathway to survival. During this time, Margaret's other relationships had atrophied almost completely. She saw her friends less frequently. She stopped attending social functions. She declined invitations to family events. Her entire social world had contracted to a single person, Catherine. This is the mechanics of dependence. It's not dramatic. It's not coercive in an obvious way. It's simply the gradual erosion of all other options until a single relationship becomes the only source of validation, understanding, and emotional nourishment. By the time Margaret realized what was happening, she had already lost the ability to imagine life without it. The financial transfers became increasingly large and increasingly frequent. What had started as loans began to be reframed as gifts. Then they became investments. Then they became expressions of love. Catherine developed a language for these transactions that made them feel less like extraction and more like proof of commitment. "I need help," Catherine would say, and Margaret would feel honored to be the person Catherine trusted. "I have an opportunity," Catherine would say, "but I need capital," and Margaret would feel like she was building something meaningful with another person. The amounts escalated. $75,000 for a property investment that never materialized. $30,000 for a medical emergency that may or may not have existed. $80,000 for a business venture that Catherine discussed extensively, but never actually started. Each transfer was preceded by a conversation that made Margaret feel essential. Each request was framed in language that positioned Margaret as Catherine's savior, her partner, her love, and each transfer was followed by expressions of gratitude so profound that Margaret felt she was finally achieving what she'd always wanted. To be the person who mattered most to someone. The mathematics of this are important. Over 4 years, Margaret transferred $847,000 to Catherine. This wasn't Margaret's income. This was her inheritance, her security, her future, her freedom. By the time she'd given $847,000, Margaret had approximately $100,000 remaining. She was 61 years old. She had converted her financial security into the infrastructure of emotional connection with another person. This is where rational thought would normally reassert itself. This is where Margaret would look at the numbers and realize something was terribly wrong. But Catherine had been very careful to prevent this. She had ensured that Margaret didn't see the complete picture. She had made some payments back, not to reimburse Margaret, but to create the illusion that the money was circulating, that the relationship was reciprocal. She had positioned the transfers as happening between partners, not from victim to predator. She had made Margaret complicit in reframing what was happening. And most importantly, she had made sure that Margaret was more afraid of losing Catherine than she was afraid of losing her money. What does that mean? It means that when Margaret would have moments of clarity, moments when she realized the magnitude of what she'd given, Catherine would create a crisis that required Margaret's emotional response, a threat to leave, a period of distance, a reference to another person who understood Catherine better. These moments would throw Margaret into panic. She would realize in those moments that losing Catherine would be worse than losing everything else, and she would do whatever was necessary to make sure Catherine stayed. This is how $847,000 gets transferred, not through violence or coercion, but through the systematic weaponization of human need, through making someone so emotionally dependent that financial devastation seems like an acceptable price for continued connection. During the 4th year, Catherine began mentioning that she'd been offered an opportunity in another city. It was presented as hypothetical, but Margaret recognized it for what it was. Catherine was preparing to leave. Margaret began to give more money, faster, trying to create something that would keep Catherine present. She was trying to purchase love through increased financial sacrifice, and Catherine accepted these payments while continuing to talk about leaving. This is the cruelty at the heart of this story. It's not that Catherine was using Margaret. It's that Catherine had created a situation where she could use Margaret, and Margaret would interpret the using as proof of love. The final transfer was $50,000, made in desperation, made to convince Catherine to stay, made by someone who had completely lost the ability to see what was happening. And then Catherine disappeared. She didn't leave a note. She didn't provide an explanation. She didn't even officially end their relationship. She simply vanished, the way someone vanishes when they've extracted everything they need, and staying becomes more difficult than leaving. She left Margaret with an empty apartment, an emptied bank account, and the most devastating question, had any of it been real? The discovery happened in stages, which made it even more devastating than a single sudden revelation would have been. First, Catherine simply didn't return Margaret's calls. This wasn't unusual. Catherine had periods where she was distant, where she needed space, where Margaret had to prove her commitment by accepting the abandonment without complaint. Margaret waited. She didn't try to contact Catherine for 3 days, then 4 days, then a week. She told herself that Catherine was processing something, that Catherine needed time, that their relationship had peaks and valleys, and this was just a valley. But valleys, when they're caused by emotional dependence, are terrifying. Margaret found herself unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to focus on anything except the absence. After 2 weeks, she called the building where Catherine's apartment was. She asked for Catherine Wells. The building manager asked if she was a friend. Margaret said she was. The manager said there was no Catherine Wells in the building. No one with that name had ever lived there. This is where reality begins to intrude. This is where Margaret's carefully constructed narrative begins to crack. She contacted Catherine's office, the place where they'd had their initial therapy sessions. The office confirmed that they had never employed a Catherine Wells. They had no record of her. The therapist they referred people to had a different name, and when Margaret called, the therapist said she'd never heard of Catherine Wells. Margaret then did something she'd been unable to do in years. She contacted her brother. She told him everything: the money, the relationship, the vanishing. Her brother, who was both furious and compassionate, helped her try to track Catherine. They went to the police. The police explained that this was not technically a theft. Margaret had given the money freely, had never established a contract, had no documentation of loans. There was no crime to prosecute. Margaret had simply been abandoned. But that's what made it worse. Because if it had been a crime, there would be someone to blame externally. There would be a perpetrator to hate, a legal system to navigate, a framework for understanding what had happened. Instead, there was just the slow recognition that she had given away her security to someone who may have never existed in any real sense. The rationalization she'd constructed began to collapse. All those explanations for Catherine's behavior, the difficult childhood, the financial struggles, the emotional unavailability that Margaret had accepted as proof of depth and complexity, what if those had been fabrications? What if Catherine had studied psychology not to heal people but to manipulate them? What if every moment of seeming intimacy had been performance? What if the person Margaret had loved most was constructed entirely from what Margaret needed to believe? The hardest part wasn't losing the money. The hardest part was the question that emerged. At what point had she decided that love was more important than truth? At what point had she become willing to believe a beautiful lie rather than investigate an uncomfortable reality? There was a moment, approximately 2 years into the relationship, when Margaret had noticed an inconsistency. Catherine had told her a story about her childhood that didn't align with something Catherine had said 6 months earlier. Margaret had noticed it. She'd felt a small flutter of doubt. And then she'd made a choice. She'd decided to not think about it. She'd decided that people can have false memories, that trauma can distort narrative, that love means accepting people's contradictions. She'd made that choice consciously, and then she'd made it again and again. Every time doubt emerged, she'd chosen Catherine over truth. Every time inconsistency appeared, she'd rationalized it away. And by the time she realized what was happening, she had already surrendered the ability to trust her own perception. This is what the deepest deception does. It doesn't just take money. It takes your sense of reality. It takes your ability to trust your own mind. It takes the part of you that can distinguish between love and manipulation, between caring and using, between intimacy and performance. And the hardest part of recovery is not rebuilding your financial security. It's rebuilding your faith that you can ever know what's real again. What happened to Catherine is a question that may never be answered. Did she move to another city and repeat this process with another lonely person? Did she encounter someone who discovered her before the extraction was complete? Did she disappear because she was afraid Margaret was beginning to see her? Or did she vanish simply because staying required more maintenance than leaving? Margaret spent months trying to find her. She hired investigators. She contacted the police again. She reviewed photographs, trying to identify Catherine in old pictures, trying to find some documentation that proved Catherine had actually existed. She discovered that Catherine's apartment had never been in Catherine's name. It was rented by a woman named Patricia Morrison, who had no forwarding address and no known relatives. The property management company had records of several other names associated with the apartment over the years. This is when the horror truly crystallized. Catherine may not have been a single person. She may have been a practice, a method, a personality that could be inhabited by different women. There may have been multiple Catherines, each one constructed specifically for a particular target. Or there may have been a single Catherine who had learned to be multiple versions of herself depending on who she was with. The psychological profile of someone who could do this is not simple. This is not a person with a single psychological wound. This is someone who has learned, through necessity or circumstance, to become whoever other people need them to be. Someone who has fragmented their own identity so completely that there may be no core self left, only the capacity to mirror back what others want to see. In a way, this is as tragic as what happened to Margaret, because what Catherine had done to Margaret, the extraction, the isolation, the manipulation, were techniques learned somewhere. Someone had done this to Catherine. Someone had taught her that love was a tool, that vulnerability could be weaponized, that becoming indispensable was the only way to survive. And now Catherine was moving through the world doing to others what had been done to her. Margaret eventually learned to live with the uncertainty. She rebuilt her financial life, slowly, with the help of her brother and a financial advisor. She recovered approximately 60% of what she'd lost through careful reinvestment and modest returns. But the money was never the real loss. The real loss was the person she thought she was during those 4 years. The version of Margaret who believed she was helping someone she loved. The version of Margaret who felt finally necessary. That version of Margaret couldn't exist after Catherine vanished, because that version of Margaret had been constructed by someone who was using her need for purpose as a tool. And understanding that made it impossible to trust any version of herself ever again. Margaret spent her final years quiet, more alone than she'd been before therapy, afraid of connection, but also afraid of isolation. She had learned something that shouldn't be learned about human nature, that the people who understand us most deeply can use that understanding against us, that intimacy and exploitation can exist in the same moment, that someone can genuinely care about you while simultaneously using you, and there's no way to tell where the caring ends and the using begins. Her friends who had watched her disappear into the relationship with Catherine, who had tried to warn her, who had seen the financial transfers as obviously predatory, they didn't fully understand the mechanics of what had happened. They thought Catherine had deliberately deceived Margaret, but the truth was more complex. Catherine had probably believed in certain moments that she genuinely loved Margaret, that the affection was real even as the extraction was happening, that the friendship was authentic even though it was constructed. This is what separates this story from a simple theft. It's not clear whether Catherine was conscious of her own manipulation. It's possible she had fragmented herself so completely that she didn't know where the performance ended and the person began. And if that's true, then she was as much a victim as Margaret was. Just a different kind of victim. Someone so broken that breaking others was the only way she knew how to survive. This story raises questions we rarely ask about ourselves. Not because we can't articulate them, but because answering them honestly is uncomfortable. What separates love from manipulation? Is it the intention of the person doing the loving, or the effect on the person being loved? If someone makes you feel genuinely better, genuinely seen, genuinely understood, and that person is simultaneously extracting your resources and isolating you from other relationships, which is real? The love or the extraction? Or are they the same thing? Margaret was destroyed by someone who may have genuinely cared about her. Catherine may have been destroyed by someone else who also genuinely cared about her. At some point in this chain of destruction, someone made a choice. Someone decided that their need mattered more than another person's security. Someone learned that vulnerability could be exploited, and they passed that knowledge forward, the way all knowledge passes forward, through action, through consequence, through the slow accumulation of damage that becomes normalized. We tell ourselves that we can recognize manipulation. We tell ourselves that we would never be vulnerable enough to fall for it. We tell ourselves that we're intelligent enough, aware enough, careful enough to protect ourselves. And then we meet someone who understands us, someone who listens the way we've always needed to be listened to, someone who makes us feel like we finally matter. And in that moment we would give them anything, not because we're foolish, because we're human, because we are all, at our core, searching for someone to see us completely and stay. That's not a character flaw. That's the architecture of human connection. And someone who understands that architecture, who can use it like a tool, can extract almost anything. Margaret had resources, but this could happen to anyone with something to give: money, time, emotional energy, access, stability. This could happen to anyone who has ever wanted to be essential to another person. This could happen to you, not because you're naive, but because being vulnerable to love is the price of being capable of love. And there's no way to love someone without becoming in some way hostage to that person's choices. Catherine understood this. Whether she understood it consciously, or whether she was simply acting from the wounded logic of someone who'd been destroyed, is unclear, but she understood it, and she used it. And Margaret spent the rest of her life trying to reconcile the person she thought she was with the person she'd become. Someone who had given away her security to someone who may have never existed. Someone who had confused being needed with being loved. Someone who had learned that trust is a vulnerability you can't protect against once you've decided to let someone in. What does this reveal about us? That we are all capable of being both Margaret and Catherine. That we all have needs deep enough to override our judgment. That we all have the capacity to use other people's needs against them if we're desperate enough, broken enough, afraid enough. That the difference between love and predation is sometimes just a matter of perspective. And that sometimes the person we love most is the person we know least, and we choose not to know them better, because the knowing would shatter the story we've built about who they are. We choose the lie, not because we're weak, but because the truth sometimes is more devastating than any deception. This channel exists because deception reveals something true about all of us. We've all been Margaret. We've all been on the edge of Catherine. We've all felt the seduction of being finally, completely understood. And we've all made the choice, sometimes once, sometimes many times, to believe the person we needed to believe in, rather than the evidence that contradicted them. That's not a character flaw. That's humanity. If you've experienced deception like this, if you've been the one who gave everything to someone who may have been constructed, or if you've been the one constructing yourself to meet someone else's needs, share your story at velvettraps@gmail.com. We're interested in the psychological patterns. What did you miss? What did you see? What does it reveal about how trust works? And most importantly, could you do it again? If someone understood you the way Catherine understood Margaret, would you protect yourself, or would you choose the lie? Every submission is read. Your experience matters.